Good afternoon, and welcome to the inaugural Hurst Community Initiative Town Hall Speaker Series. My name is Evan Zislis. I'm the Director of Community Engagement for the Aspen Institute's Hurst Community Initiative. The work of HCI is focused on promoting dialogue, increasing understanding, and facilitating opportunities for meaningful collaboration among the communities of Aspen to Parachute, Colorado, located on ancestral lands of the Northern Ute tribe. Today is the final event of an 8-part speaker series in collaboration with the regional public libraries and chambers of commerce of Aspen, Basalt, Carbondale, Glenwood Springs, Newcastle, Silt, Rifle, and Parachute. Throughout the series, interested stakeholders tuned in to learn more about the issues facing our communities and the local experts working to find collaborative solutions to the shared challenges of our region. Today's topic is Aspen Water, the future of the Roaring Fork Watershed and beyond. Co-hosted by the Pitkin County Library and the Aspen Chamber Resort Association, today's Zoom host is Garfield County Libraries, and interpretation to Spanish is brought to you by Velasco Language Services. Real briefly, we're gonna have Alex jump on and explain English to Spanish translation. Alex?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us again. If you allow me just a minute, I will share my screen to go over our Zoom functions. Okay. As we have mentioned, this is a Zoom webinar. We have a couple of options to communicate with each other. The first one is our chat box. This is our quicker communication function. If you have any technical issues or any quick comments you'd like to make, this is the one you would use. If you need any help figuring out how to use your chat, please let me know. Our Q&A is where we want to put in any questions to the panelists or the presenters. Our Q&A does save the questions we have until a later time where we can answer them towards the end of our session today. And finally, this is being translated into Spanish simultaneously. There is an English and Spanish channel. If you look at your menu, your options for your Zoom at the bottom right, you will see a gridded globe icon. Go ahead and press this icon and choose the language of your preference. If you're listening in English, press English. If you're listening in Spanish, push Spanish. And if you get any audio interference, make sure you mute your original audio. If you need any help with our chat, our Q&A, or our interpretation options, please let me know, and we'll be here to help you as soon as we can. Back to Evan.
Thanks, Alex. As Alex mentioned, please use the chat feature for technical questions, and you may ask questions for our panel using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll leave time at the end to answer as many questions as possible. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so I want to introduce our moderator and our esteemed panel for today's discussion. First, Luke Runyon. Luke has covered the Colorado River Basin for public radio station KUNC in Colorado since 2017 and produces feature stories for a network of public media stations across the Southwest. Before covering water at KUNC, he covered the agriculture and food beat in Colorado for 5 years as a reporter for Harvest Public Media. He's also reported for Aspen Public Radio. His reports have been featured on NPR's Morning Edition, All Things Considered, Here and Now, and APM's Marketplace. Next, we have Heather Sackett. Heather is water desk editor at the nonprofit news organization Aspen Journalism. She has covered water issues on Colorado's Western Slope and the Roaring Fork Valley since 2017. She has a background in community news and has worked for the Telluride Daily Planet, the Denver Post, and the Littleton Independent. Heather has a master's degree in environmental journalism from CU Boulder, and her work has been recognized by the Colorado Press Association and the Society of Professional Journalists. And lastly, Steve Hunter. Steve is the Utility Resource Manager for the City of Aspen. Steve is a licensed water resource engineer and professional hydrologist who has worked on water resources and hydrology, including post-wildfire restoration, both locally and regionally, for over 15 years. Steve's professional interests focus on water in the West, including drought, climate change, water scarcity, and wildfires. Steve is an undergraduate degree from Oregon State University and a master's in engineering from the University of Wyoming. We're honored to have everyone joining us today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Luke.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much, Evan, and the Aspen Institute for hosting this event, and to Garfield County Libraries for facilitating. Like Evan said, my name is Luke Runyon. I report on water issues for KUNC and a network of NPR stations all throughout the Colorado River Basin. I've got two Colorado River Basin maps behind me, which has been very helpful in my, now that we've been on Zoom for far too long. I'm going to give just a brief overview of kind of where things are on the western slope and in the Colorado River Basin generally, and then I'll start asking some questions of Heather and Steve, and I want to keep this pretty informal. And we're short on time, an hour goes by really quickly, and I want to make sure that we get questions from the audience too. So we'll chat for about 45 minutes and then open it up for Q&A from the audience. So since I'm the lone front ranger in this panel, and both of the other panelists are on the western slope, you guys probably actually know more about the on the ground impacts of drought this year. But this year, 2021, is kind of an unprecedented combination of things that have come together to create a really serious situation on Colorado's western slope and in the Colorado River Basin more generally. We're seeing water shortages in river basins across the western slope, curtailments of farmers not being able to receive their full allocations of irrigation water, streams drying up, fishing closures of some tributaries to the Colorado River, temperature records being broken, record low soil moisture throughout the region, which is having impacts to agriculture, fisheries, municipal supplies, which I'm hoping we'll hear more from Steve about. And if you've been paying attention to the news, which I'm sure Heather and I have over the last couple months, the headlines kind of tell the whole story, which is just how serious this situation is in the Colorado River Basin. Lake Powell just this past weekend, which is the second largest reservoir in the country, hit its record low, breaking a record from 2005. Lake Mead, a few weeks before that, did the same thing, hitting its record low, which is the nation's largest reservoir, and both of those are on the Colorado River. And I think even more worrisome is that both of those reservoirs are projected to decline even further. So this isn't just like hitting a record low and then going back up. They're both projected to decline. So with that as kind of the setup, as the seriousness, maybe just to start, both Heather and Steve, in a dry year like the one that we're in, following a bunch of other dry years that are very recent in the rearview mirror, what do you see as the biggest water challenges that are facing the Roaring Fork Valley, maybe to Steve and the city of Aspen? And then Heather, what do you see as kind of the water challenges on the western slope? Steve, you want to go first?
Sure, thanks, Luke. And that's a great segue. You mentioned how dry we are. Here in the upper Colorado headwater basin of the Roaring Fork Valley, we're in our third drought in the last 4 years. I moved here 37 years ago, and we'd see drought every decade or so, and now we're seeing them back to back much more frequently. So drought is definitely one of the biggest threats, I think, challenges for not only the Roaring Fork watershed, Aspen, but the Colorado watershed as a whole. I think we're all in this together. You can't separate. Watershed divides don't, everybody we're all in this one together. So drought, wildfire, which are inherently linked, obviously, and then other natural disasters are kind of the thing that kind of keeps me up at night. But I think with that, using the best available science and data, we can come up with practical solutions. And that, I think, from Aspen all the way down to the border regarding water use and efficient water use. Speaking for Aspen itself, I can't speak for other municipalities within the watershed, but Aspen, one of our problems, I guess, or one of our potential issues is we don't have any redundancy. So we get most of our water from Castle and Maroon Creeks, as you guys know. Those are adjacent watersheds. They're small watersheds. So if you had some kind of natural disaster, such as a wildfire, for instance, or beetle kill or contaminants, they're not really redundant watersheds because they're so close to each other. And we don't have a backup supply. So that's something we're looking at in the future. I know other municipalities are. Glenwood, for example, we had the Grizzly Creek wildfire last year, which has closed I-70 numerous times in the last couple of weeks. And that is the primary drinking water supply for the town of Glenwood Springs. And then their redundancy, which is not a preferred redundancy, is the Roaring Fork River. But that has showed that if they didn't have that redundancy, that could have become an issue this past year.
Heather, what do you see kind of region-wide or statewide this year?
Well, I think this year is really just the story of everything you just mentioned, just the really bad hydrology. I think climate change has really been driving a lot of that, and it's happening a lot faster than a lot of water managers expected. One of the big parts of my job is to go around the state, and I cover all of these water meetings. So there's 9 basin roundtables in the state of Colorado for each of the different river basins. And then I also cover the Colorado Water Conservation Board, which is kind of the state level. They make a lot of the water policy decisions for the state of Colorado, and the Colorado River District, which covers 15 counties on the western slope. And they all had their meetings last week, which was super fun for me. But a recurring theme was just the really bad hydrology. The River District had this one presentation where they had their engineer had the map of Colorado and the data from the US Drought Monitor, and it went from January 2020 up until now, and you can just see week by week it's getting increasingly worse, just creeping back in, going from yellow to red to pink to purple. It's kind of like they're having to invent new colors on the maps because conditions keep worsening. And so I think just, as temperatures rise, and which leads to less water in streams. I think that's the biggest challenge, is just how are we going to meet all of the demands that already exist? And there's a bunch more water projects on the table for further development of water. And so, how is Colorado going to do this with supplies that are just dwindling all the time?
One of the things that gets complicated in this whole discussion is how the West manages its water. And Colorado has this super complicated system of water rights water is owned by the state, but people and cities and farmers can have rights to use that water. Steve, can you just give like the elevator pitch of how water rights in Colorado work, knowing that none of us are lawyers, so we're abdicating that, but just kind of the layman's explanation of how water rights work.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. And for any water rights attorneys on the call, my apologies in advance. But in Colorado and most of the West, we're under the prior appropriation system, which comes from mining law in the 1800s. And it's basically first in time, first in right. So the more senior, the older your water right is, you have priority to that water. And generally in a free river condition, or when we're not in drought and we have ample water, things get along relatively okay. Most of the rivers in the West are over allocated, meaning there's more water on paper than there is physically. And when we have droughts, especially back to back, Luke, as you and Heather have mentioned, it becomes all the more challenging because it's not equitable across the board. If you're junior, they start cutting. The state engineer is in charge of the water rights and how that, and their commissioners are out there in the field and they do a heck of a job, a tough job, but they have to curtail folks based on their seniority. And priority depends on 2 things. It depends on your adjudication of your right and then the appropriation date. And that gives you that seniority. So obviously senior water rights are extremely valuable. And in the future, they may become even more so, because now we're seeing, Luke, as you just mentioned, with the lower Colorado number 2 and number 1 and 2 reservoirs that are coming towards kind of a water level here, not too distant future, that they couldn't produce power and or get water out to their customers. If that happens, there's a potential for a Colorado River Water Compact call. So any rights that are senior to 1922 should be okay if the water's physically there. Anything after that could potentially get called us, the upper basin states, Colorado being one of those. So it could get very interesting for all of us water professionals and those covering water in the next couple of years. It's definitely the most interesting time in my water career that I've witnessed in the West.
Heather, do you hear people talking about that threat of a compact call? Like, how present is that in the minds of the people that you're covering, the water managers, the irrigation districts, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I would say it's definitely present. It's this constant looming threat that grows seemingly bigger by the day. It's the compact call is sort of this overarching law of the river that just determines how water is managed in the upper basin and the lower basin. And the upper basin managers really want to avoid a compact call scenario. And so a goal is to try to get more water into Lake Powell to try to avoid that. But it's definitely, it's huge, it's ever present. It's sort of the backdrop setting for this whole water crisis that's unfolding.
So Steve, I wanted to ask you, because I've seen some coverage of Aspen working on this integrated water management plan. Can you explain a little bit about what that is and how the city is going about creating that plan?
Sure can. So basically, I can't get into the nitty gritty. The IRP, as we call it, or integrated resource plan, plan. It's a 50-year planning document for the city to kind of see how we are going to provide a safe, reliable, clean water supply to our customers now, 50 years out to 2070, with all those looming things like climate change and back-to-back droughts and other wildfires, population growth, more visitors. So this is a planning document. It basically evaluates our current water supply portfolio and then makes a plan to guide us, once again, to have a safe, resilient, and reliable water supply to our customers now and in the future, while also maintaining the city's commitment to environmental stewardship, like our in-stream flow program that we work with Colorado Water Conservation Board on, both on the Roaring Fork, Hunter Creek, Maroon Creek, and Castle Creek. It basically we had consultants work on this. It's currently being peer reviewed to make sure the numbers, dot all the I's, cross all the T's, and we'll be taking it to Aspen City Council sometime, hopefully in August or September, so they can review it and hopefully adopt it. And then we'll start implementing projects. But some of it, we looked at supply forecast, which a bunch of climate models. We worked with the Aspen Global Climate Change Institute. We looked at demand forecast. We looked at potential gaps out into the future, and then redundancy and how, if you have an emergency where your water supply is knocked out of Castle and Maroon, what do you do in that emergency scenario to provide water for not only your customers and visitors, but for firefighting and stuff of that nature. And I can tell you that the preferred alternative that we're initially looking at is looking at it. The city of Aspen, as you guys probably know, has a pretty robust water conservation program, water efficient landscaping program. We also have a drought mitigation response plan that we're implementing right now. We're in stage 2 water restrictions, as you may know. So that has a bunch of categories to try to minimize specifically outdoor irrigation uses during droughts. We're getting pretty good at it, being that we've had it implemented 3 times in the last 4 years. We're looking at groundwater wells, potentially for an emergency backup supply. We're looking to implement a non-potable water reuse project here in the not too distant futures. And this is stuff you're hearing across the West. I'm sure both Heather and Luke, you guys are hearing this stuff. It's not, there's some big picture stuff out there, but a lot of people are looking at reuse and how to be more efficient and water conservation methods, drought management, how you basically, you'll see demand management stuff, how you manage demand to meet supply. So all of those are things we're looking at in our toolbox. Storage is one we're potentially looking at, to paste on the gaps. And that is just another tool in the toolbox. I don't see that in the near term by any means. And that might be something that we collaborate with another entity or several entities within the Roaring Fork Valley as a kind of a redundant and backup source. So those are things that we don't know yet, but we're investigating currently. And I think to wrap it up, the reason the city thinks this is necessary, I think anybody in the West, municipality, or other organization who deals with water, who's not planning and looking into the future, is doing their customers a disservice. It's a really interesting time. And I think planning, they're calling it planning within deep uncertainty, which is classic. And that's coming from PhD level scientists. So, we can only use the best available data and the best available science to try to help, make sure that Aspen and its customers has, water now and into the future, but knowing that Aspen is not a bubble. We are part of the greater picture. A lot of the water supply originates here. So we have to do our part to really take care of that resource.
As you were listing off those potential projects, the reuse, the groundwater, new conservation programs, it all sounds expensive for a city like Aspen. How do you end up going about paying for all of that? Like, are rate increases part of that for water? Does funding come from grants? Like, what kind of funding can you guys go after to try and make some of those projects possible?
Sure, that's a great question. So for like reuse, for example, we had a meeting with Governor Hickenlooper, or not Governor, Senator Hickenlooper's staff last week. So the Bureau of Reclamation, EPA, are putting out pretty large grants, millions of dollars in grants, funding, and it's only going to get larger as part of the water component of the hopefully new infrastructure package. So there's a lot of money for drought, and a lot of it's focused with Bureau of Reclamation, obviously, for Western water projects, for conservation, for enhancement. They are well aware, as the #1 federal water manager in the West, of what's happening. So they know it's not everybody's got to join in this together. And you're absolutely right. Everything to do with water is expensive. And Aspen and most of the West, we've lived fairly, water prices are pretty cheap, which we may not take care of it as much if, we're a little more expensive. Will water rates, electricity rates, power rates, all that stuff go up in the future? I would imagine yes. I'm speaking as the West as a whole, the nation as a whole, to make sure we have it and it lasts in the future. A lot of the dams, reservoirs, pipelines, et cetera, overhead power lines with energy, a lot of these things are coming to the end of their useful life. They were built in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and now have to be replaced, but everything costs money. But right now, we're currently involved in, I think, 3 federal grants with Bureau of Reclamation on numerous water projects, including one we're here trying to do a enhanced monitoring and hydrologic monitoring up here, trying to get a snowtail site up in Castle Creek, as well as another USGS stream gauge. So there is funding opportunities out there. I think more and more, though, you're going to see a lot more people going for a slice of a finite pie.
Yeah, I was just on that front. I was speaking with the deputy general manager of the Southern Nevada Water Authority. So this is the water wholesale agency for the greater Las Vegas area. And she said flat out that water rates are going to go up in the future, that there's really no way around it, that if you're curbing use, so you have people using less, they're asking people to use less water, then rates have to go up in order to pay for some of the conservation that they're doing there. So I think you're spot on that West-wide, there's going to be some rate hikes in the very near future. One thing that we just touched on a little bit, but I wonder if you can go in a little bit more detail, Steve, is on water storage. Aspen had some of these plans for a while to look at increased water storage projects on some of the creeks that it relies on for its water supply. And I think when some people in the West think of storage, their mind immediately goes to big dams and reservoirs. Do you think that Aspen, you're talking about redundancy, does Aspen need to have more options for storage, and what does that look like?
That's a great question. And that's part of this IRP process that we haven't finalized. So those will be out here for everybody to see in a couple months. I believe having a diverse portfolio, a range of options where you can pull from, so you're not impacting one water resource over another. And then in the course of an emergency, wildfire, drought, avalanches, we saw the avalanches in 2019 shut down some of the intakes for a while. We were lucky enough to get this. But the city has to have some redundancy, and that's what we're trying to build into the system. And I think everybody in the West wants that. I mean, it's kind of a state of the practice. If you look at the bigger municipalities, Denver, Nevada, these places try to have like 2.5 years of water supply redundant. Aspen had the water rights, the conditional rights up on Castle and Maroon, and they were, I think, from the 60s, if I'm not mistaken, but I think that was a pencil number. So now we're actually doing an analysis, a scientific and engineering analysis, to find out what potentially that gap would be, how you can close that gap using things we can implement in short order, and they all cost money, Luke, I agree. But in short order, the enhanced conservation, the non-potable reuse, getting the wells online for backup that we have. We just have to go through some, once again, yeah, they all cost money. Storage is kind of out on the end of it. The thing with storage is, we're not looking at any on-channel storage. They brought me on board because I'm an environmentalist. I have my undergrad in hydrology and fisheries biology. I've been a lifelong fly fishing and a guide in this valley, Alaska. Dams are very controversial, but how you meet that, and if you push it off until you think you may need it, it's already too late. And I think there's technology that's coming along. A lot of these things, when you think of it, Luke, you said it perfectly. You think storage, you think of a big dam, a reservoir, fish that can't get by the dam. And nowadays they're using a lot of different technology, including in situ. So you would do it, there's a technology, engineering technology, you do slurry walls for a specific volume. You pump it into a well can be behind literally some bushes, and you do it in an open space. And you only use that water in an emergency situation. I mean, the city of Aspen, I came from the feds. I've been with the city about a little over a year now. They do have a pretty good environmental ethos they want us to follow, and they know their constituents and the Valley residents as a whole will hold them to that. So those are things we're looking at pretty hard.
I'm sitting in the city of Greeley right now on the Front Range, and Greeley just did a huge purchase of some underground water resources just north of the city for that exact same reason. They were trying to build a larger dam to store more water in a reservoir, and it didn't look likely that was going to happen. So they switched, and now they're pursuing this large groundwater recharge project. So it's not just something on the western slope. Yeah, I think you're probably right that a lot of cities are looking at that groundwater recharge. Heather, I wonder if we can zoom out just a little bit and look at the situation statewide or region-wide. What kind of solutions are you hearing as you're covering, these various water agencies, Colorado Water Conservation Board, basin roundtables? What are you hearing as you're covering those meetings that people are talking about to kind of figure out this balance between supply and demand?
Well, one thing that the state of Colorado is exploring right now is something called demand management. And so what that is it would be a way to try to get more water into Lake Powell to try to avoid that compact call we talked about. So just big picture, the Colorado River Compact from 1922, it sets out an agreement where the upper basin, which is Colorado, Wyoming, New Mexico, Utah, is required to deliver a certain amount of water to the lower basin. And if we don't do that, then they could institute a compact call, which would mean that the upper basin, we would have to take mandatory cutbacks. And so everybody in the upper basin kind of wants to avoid that. We don't know what that could look like. It could be really painful for certain water users. So it's just a thing that we want to avoid. And so therefore, the state of Colorado is looking into a demand management program, which would essentially pay agriculture producers to not use water. And that's because most of the water in Western Colorado is in agriculture. And so they would pay them in a temporary voluntary program to just leave the water in the river. It would get sent down to Lake Powell and basically put in this insurance bucket where it would be used to avoid that compact call. And this is immensely complicated. The state they convened 9 different work groups to try to look at all of the different issues and the unintended consequences that could come from this program. And that's been an ongoing effort for about at least 2 years now. And so they still haven't decided if this is something that they want to move forward with. And my most recent story talks about kind of where they're at in that process. And so the state, with all the input from these nine work groups, they've developed this framework. It's this matrix that sets out basically 3 tiers of what a potential program could look like, with sort of increasing levels of complicatedness. And the CWCB is beginning to receive some feedback from water users on that matrix. And so what you're hearing from a lot of groups like environmental groups and certain water users out there is they're saying, you know, we've been looking at this for 2 years. There's been enough discussions. We want to see some action. The hydrology has gotten so bad, so much faster than anyone had anticipated. And people want to start seeing some pilot projects to see, you know, what does demand management look like? Can it work for the state of Colorado? And so the CWCB still hasn't made any determination on if, you know, if they're going to go forward with this. It's still something they're looking at, but I would definitely say there's a sense of urgency around this. This program was, or the potential for this program was something that was set out in the drought contingency plan from what year was that, Luke? 2019?
2019.
Yeah, and so it's kind of like the clock is ticking because they only have until 2026 to kind of figure out if this is something that can work or not. But you definitely hear in certain circles this sense of urgency, like we need to move on this now. But then, you know, you also hear from some other people who advocate sort of more of a conservative, you know, if we're going to do this, we need to make sure it's done right so that certain water users don't end up bearing the brunt of any negative negative impacts of this. So yeah, so that's kind of where it's at right now. But it's still something, it's a statewide solution that Colorado is looking at right now.
What are the concerns that people have about this demand management program? Like, who's concerned about it and what are their top concerns?
Well, you definitely hear from some different water user groups, conservancy districts, and even roundtables who, you know, they all agree that something needs to be done, but they want to make sure that their basin and their agriculture users aren't going to be the ones that are going to be impacted. So like, for example, with the temporary voluntary aspect, you know, ag producers could raise their hand and be like, okay, I want to participate. I would like to get money in exchange for my water. But if everybody in one certain valley does that, now that valley is completely dry. And even though it's a temporary program, you know, it might be something like 1 out of every 3 years or 1 out of every 5 years. You could do this with your fields, but you know, if everybody in one area did it at the same time, that could cause problems for, you know, the local economy or environmental issues or downstream users who depend on return flows, for example. So there's just like a whole host of potential outcomes that like we don't really know how they're going to unfold until we actually do it.
Okay, that's everyone's homework, is to go check out the demand management matrix, because everyone loves a matrix.
Yes.
So, we've talked a little bit about some different users. So we've got cities like the city of Aspen, and farmers who are the majority water user in not just the state of Colorado, but west-wide. And Steve, one thing that we hear about sometimes is this rigidity that's in Western water law that, you touched on it when explaining kind of the prior appropriation system, that it's not the most flexible system. It's pretty rigid in how it treats different water users and water right holders. But we've seen some moves in kind of creating some flexibility and having cities and farmers able to work together, whether that's a leasing program or something like that. Has Aspen worked on anything like that? And what would that flexibility look like there?
Sure, thanks. So, I mean, not a couple years ago, but a couple decades ago, having water left in the stream for the sake of water in the stream was kind of unheard of. It was difficult legally to do. There has been some legal changes to allow for beneficial in-stream flows for environment, fish, wildlife, and recreational, as far as RISs, recreational in-channel diversions. So those are some things that we've seen in our lifetime. We are currently working on a project kind of similar to what it's kind of a demand management strategy, if you will, called an ATM, or alternative transfer mechanism. And these things are basically a fancy way of saying, okay, a water sharing agreement, if you will. So it's not the old buy and dry where a city, municipality, water utility would go in, buy X ranch, dry up the landscape, and use that water. They buy that and then it's a done deal. This, similar to the demand management, is having a farmer or an irrigator maybe fallow a field during a drought or in a time of need and get equitable pay from the municipality for using that water. But it's an agreement that is over a period of time. It's not in perpetuity, as far as I know, and it's not a done deal. It's not the dry, buy and dry. Challenge Aspen has, as you guys well probably know, is this is something, if you're in Weld County or up where you are, Luke, you have a lot more agricultural opportunities to do. And the Roaring Fork Valley may have had those in the past. There's still some gentlemen, ranchers with some 35-acre hayfields, but there's not a ton of opportunities. That said, we are looking with some potential ditch opportunities. We do it with CWCB. We're doing it this year. We did it last year with the Wheeler ditch. We have a non-diversion agreement. We curtail our diversion to try to leave a couple more CFS in the Roaring Fork just to help with environmental flows and fisheries and wildlife. So we are working on a project like that, and it's kind of a experimental. We're working with CWCB and a consultant on this, and it hasn't been done on the Western Slope, at least up in the upper headwaters. It may, it would make more sense potentially in Junction or down Clifton, where you have some agricultural interests, but down there you got the Grand Valley Canal, and it's a whole different deal. But we're trying to see if it will work up here on a smaller scale. So yeah, we're looking at that.
So some of it is just kind of where cities and agriculture intermix in some of these areas, that whether or not they actually make sense. Aspen is like at the headwaters, so it becomes difficult to kind of make those arrangements.
Yeah, exactly. But I think with some, kind of thinking through things maybe outside the box a little bit, we might come up with something. Then again, we might not. The other thing, I think you asked Heather, what is some of the holding back people from jumping into these practices? I think water rights is a big one. People are just afraid, even though they can be told to kind of give up your water right, even temporarily, can be something that's very foreign to somebody who has been born and raised fifth generation use it or lose it. Anything that goes down here, and then if you don't use it and put it to beneficial use, you potentially are up for abandonment of that water right, or a portion of that water right. So that's ingrained in the Western, water ethic, if you will.
And for a lot of those farms and ranchers, your water right is probably the most valuable asset that you have on your farm or ranch, depending on what kind of water right it is.
Yep.
So I've just got a couple more questions before we open it up to the audience. But to both of you, what do you think are some of the big ideas, like the big kind of out of the box solutions that people are starting to talk about when we talk about water scarcity in the West? What are we starting to hear kind of bubble up in some of these places? You mentioned water reuse and recycling, but what are some of the, like, how are people starting to think about this in more radical ways to try and solve this problem? Heather?
So back in January, the Center for Colorado River Studies, which includes some of the foremost academic experts on the Colorado River, they released a white paper called Alternative Management Paradigms for the Future of the Colorado River. And so they provided some really thought-provoking, almost radically different ideas than what people have always talked about in water management, and just like the way that the river's been historically managed. And they say, the current strategy is what we've always been doing. The status quo is not going to be enough to meet management objectives and under these hydrologic conditions. And so they laid out some really radical ideas, like fill Lake Powell first, or fill Lake Mead first, and maybe rethink certain aspects of the Colorado River Compact. And so, that's one area, sort of big picture. And then also recently, there was just a paper, I think last week, it was a report done by some environmental groups, American Rivers, Audubon, Western Resource Advocates, and they presented its 10 strategies for, I think it's just called the 10 strategies report. And it presents, it's sort of this shift from the way that we've traditionally managed water to more resilience in the face of climate change. And so they present 10 different investments, like forest management or regenerative agriculture or urban conservation or covering reservoirs and canals, reducing dust on snow, all these sort of innovative strategies that haven't really been part of the conversation up until now. And it just sort of represents a shift in thinking in the face of climate change. And it's more about how are we going to be resilient with this ongoing crisis. So I don't know, those are two kind of like big picture, where some of like the foremost thinkers in the Colorado River water world are really coming up with new ideas.
Steve, what do you hear about?
Yeah, no, those, I'm interested to read that paper, Heather. The other one, yeah, that's kind of a lot of the same stuff. Those aren't really outside the box, but reuse is a big one. Municipal conservation, things are changing. You mentioned Las Vegas. I think they just started any sort of irrigation on I forget what the terminology is, but I think that's stuff we need to see here. We are in an arid environment, and a lot of us have come from other areas that might not be as arid, and we bring hey, we want our bluegrass lawn and this, that, and the other thing, and it's just not sustainable in my professional estimation. Agricultural efficiencies, once again, a big issue in ag, west-wide, not so much in the Roaring Fork Valley. Energy is a big one. Energy, clean energy, depending on what it is, can use a lot of water, as can big industries. So those are things you can pick up. And then innovative water solutions. I think we're all looking for that in the future. I did hear the dust on snow. We've all known that dust and snow changes the albedo of the snowpack and accelerates runoff and all that stuff. But how we're going to manage that is where my ears perked up. how we're going to pull that off. We're working with Denver Water and other municipalities on the Colorado Airborne Snow Observatory program to try to better capture some of that above the snowtail sites. We're working with Jeff Deems and his crew. So there is some cool stuff being done out there. Mother Nature, you know, Heather's saying the hydrology, I would also blame the climate and the atmosphere. It's you know, it's probably the most challenging time, and I think it's only going to get more challenging, especially as we, you know, if they're predicting another La Nina here this year, which potentially can mean below snowpack again, and then every year we kind of do this. I think it's going to really put us in a place where we've got to do something. You know, there's also been talk of big projects like piping from Lake Powell to Utah. There's some crazy ideas out there. Some are so expensive that they're just cost prohibitive. So I think the kind of more down to earth things in the short term, I'm hoping that some bright kid who's now an undergrad, you know, for their PhD thesis figures a way we can solve this problem, but I haven't seen anything yet.
Yeah, I think what bogs down a lot of the big out of the box ideas is the cost. I just actually got a letter in the mail from an NPR listener in South Carolina who said we should build a pipeline from somewhere out east, whether that's the Mississippi River Basin or somewhere else, to pipe the water to the west. And I mean, I think that it's been studied, like the Bureau of Reclamation has done a study looking at this particular concept, and the water that would be delivered. I mean, first of all, how do you capture flood water? Like that alone is kind of a challenge. And then piping water uphill to the Rocky Mountains would be incredibly energy intensive and really costly. So that any water that would get delivered to the Colorado River Basin from back east would be very expensive water. And unlike oil, where, you know, you can deliver a small amount, it's highly valuable. Well, water doesn't carry that same sort of value. I don't know, do we want to open it up to Q&A just yet, or what do you think, Evan?
Did you have something else that was on the top of mind that you haven't gotten a chance to ask yet? I'd be happy to do that. We do have some questions from our audience that I'd love to throw out.
Maybe just in that vein of like thinking about resiliency and some of these like challenging some of these widely held kind of sacrosanct concepts in Western water. Heather, I mean, we always come back to this prior appropriation system, which is what we've had for, you know, more than 100 years, 150 years in the West. Do you see like the pressures that are on water users right now who are under that prior appropriation system? Do you think that system can withstand some of those pressures? Like, are we just going to break the prior appropriation system and it's going to all fall apart?
No, at least not anytime soon. I think, yeah, it's totally ingrained in the culture of Colorado and the culture of the Western Slope. And it's a lot of water lawyers that make a lot of money, like enforcing the prior appropriation system. I think for now, it's one of those things that is going to have to be, we're going to have to work within the system to find solutions. I don't know, that's just my own opinion, but I think it's so ingrained in every aspect, and nobody that I've heard of is really thinking outside the box as far as the prior appropriation system goes. So I think for, you know, the foreseeable future, it's something we're going to have to find a way to live with and work within.
Good answer. Yeah, let's take some questions from the audience. What do we got?
There's one very specific question, and it's timely for this individual. On August 16th, I'm to present to our 107 household HOA in Missouri Heights regarding concerns about the viability of aquifers based on the 2020 Basalt Water Conservancy Missouri Heights Water Report. Considering we are on average 700 feet above the valley floor with well depths at around 300, 400 feet, I feel we are lacking in terms of options as ag uses shift from flood to sprinkler irrigation. And building resiliency and adaptation strategies, what other things can I offer as considerations to our rural area in this meeting?
Well, I would love to actually look at that 2020 Basalt Water Conservancy Missouri Heights Water Report, if that is available somewhere. I'd love to learn more about that, but I guess, do you have an augmentation plan for your HOA would be question number one. But I don't, I'm not super familiar with that particular area, but I'd love to learn more. So yeah, if I could, see that report, that'd be great. I might be able to offer some other suggestions.
Daniel, I would encourage you to reach out to Heather on that one before your HOA presentation on August 16th. We do have other questions. How are water restrictions currently being enforced in Aspen and Picken County and elsewhere? And how might enforcement strategies evolve as conditions grow worse?
Yeah, I can take that one if you want. A great resource in the Roaring Fork Valley, if you get on the Roaring Fork Conservancy's website, there are local nonprofit water nonprofit group. They have a fire and water restriction drought on their drought page for every place from Aspen all the way down to Glenwood and possibly beyond. And it'll show you what municipalities with links to those are in what stage of drought, water restrictions, if any, and fire restrictions, if any. So that's a great resource. And then for a statewide, you can get on CWCB's drought page for the same type of information statewide. Speaking for Aspen, we're in stage 2 water restrictions, actually going to city council tonight to give a quick drought update. We have had some monsoonal moisture after last year being the second to worst monsoon, North American monsoon in recorded history. So it's doing better, but it's very spatially isolated. We're down inches of rain and we're getting, I think in month to date, we're 700s overall. So we still have a long way to go. We monitor it daily, all the different parameters to find out if we will de-escalate into stage 1 or escalate further into stage 3. Right now, we're comfortable, at least for the city of Aspen, to stay in stage 2 water restrictions.
I can add to that too, because this has been something that I've actually been really interested in some of my reporting is how do you actually enforce water law? Like, how does that happen? So I was just down in Las Vegas a month ago and did a ride along with their water waste investigators who go out and issue citations for people who are having certain violations of the water rules there. So if you're watering too much on your lawn and it's running off into the street, that's considered a violation if it's just flowing into the gutter, and you can get a fine. And those fines start at $80 and then they double each time you get another fine. So they can, if you don't fix your problem, they can get very expensive very quickly. And they've got a whole kind of slew of code violations. They've got water restrictions for time of day and days of the week during parts of the year that you can water. And then in Fort Collins, where I live, over here on the Front Range, there were water restrictions last year, and the enforcement came through code enforcement. So as code officers were going out into the community, checking out code violations, if they saw people watering when you weren't supposed to, or doing certain uses that you weren't supposed to, they would be able to issue warnings and then citations. And then this is kind of the most dystopian form of that, but two or 3 years ago, I went down to Montezuma County in the Four Corners area, and there's a sheriff's deputy down there who's almost his whole role is focused on enforcing water law, mostly among agricultural producers, and would go out, and he's got a flume in the back of his truck, and he goes out and puts the flume in a ditch, and if you're over diverting from what it says on your decreed water right, he'll write you a criminal citation. It's like basically like a traffic ticket. And that's his whole job during irrigation season, is going out and enforcing water law in that county. So super interesting stuff. Once you get into the point where you have restrictions, like how do you actually make people comply with them?
This question says, what can we learn from Middle Eastern countries like Israel, who've been dealing with eredification and desertification for a long time, both in terms of public policy, legislation, and resource management?
I'm somewhat familiar with the situation in Israel. I know that they've invested a lot in desalination technology. That's kind of the big thing that you hear out of the Middle East, is all of these desalination projects. And I think there's been kind of some cross-cultural learning exchanges between the Colorado River Basin leaders and leaders in the Middle East about desalination. The one thing about desalination is, like, nobody's really using it as their full water supply. They're using it as kind of an supplemental or emergency water supply, and you have to be near a coast. So you know, you're seeing it more in kind of the Southern California area. But there have been projects that have been talked about on the in Mexico, on the Gulf of California, that, you know, potentially the state of Arizona would pay for the construction and implementation of a desalination project in Mexico, that then Mexico would take less water from the Colorado River that would benefit the state of Arizona. So you see some of these kind of interesting collaborative projects that come out of new technologies like that. You're seeing it too in the lower part of the Colorado River. This isn't desal, but Las Vegas, the Southern Nevada Water Authority, is going to help pay right now for a reuse and recycling project in Southern California. So not anywhere near Las Vegas, but they would help front some of the cost to put that recycling plant in place. And the idea would be that Southern California would use less water from the Colorado River that would benefit Las Vegas upstream. So you're seeing some interesting stuff like that.
This is sort of a related question. This says, are the types of drought we see in developing nations around the world, I'm thinking probably Africa, places like that, inevitable here in the American West? And might that inevitability force new innovations in technology and shifts in ideology in how we prioritize water as an essential resource? So projecting out decades from now. Steve, you alluded to that one undergrad who may come up with a solution that saves us all. Do you see the type of drought that places like desertified Africa, developing nations in Africa, do you see that type of drought inevitable here in the American West?
I don't know if I see that type of drought, just due to the fact we're in different hydrologic regimes and different geographic areas and how that pans out scientifically. But drought, regardless of what type, hydrological, you know, is a fact in the West. We've seen it. I think the overall answer to that person's question, it's a good question, is yes. Drought it's getting worse. And the other thing, the kind of the elephant in the room at most of these conversations, at least that I see, is population. Nobody, we're just going to figure out a way to get water to, you know, and some of the fastest growing cities are in the Western United States, including, I believe, Las Vegas and some counties in Nevada. So we're going to have to come up with new innovative solutions to do this. And I think, you know, if we see a compact call in the next 2 to 5 years, I think that's going to force the issue of moving much quicker in pace at coming up with some solutions. And I think we're going to have to cross political boundaries to come up with solutions, just like the one Luke said, you know, with Nevada and California partnering, because they know it's just not about them. It's us in this watershed. So I think the answer is yes.
And we've just got a minute left, but I wanted to end on this question, which I really like. How are we looking at issues of equity in terms of access to clean, abundant sources of water across the socioeconomic spectrum? For example, with huge disparities in income between Aspen and Parachute, Colorado, are there concerns about water quality for lower income communities of our region? For example, trailer parks and runoff from oil and gas and other environmental impacts from industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like this maybe doesn't pertain directly to the Roaring Fork Valley, but we've seen a lot more talk of inclusion of tribes in the Colorado River Basin in policy negotiations. And, there's kind of this overarching discussion in the basin about we need to use less, we need to use less. Well, lots of tribes never actually got the ability to use their water rights at all. They weren't given the funds or the means to build infrastructure to use. So you kind of have to have some nuance in the discussion about how do you reduce overall use while still providing opportunity to people who never got the chance to use their rights in the first place. And that's something that you're hearing a lot more about, especially with Interior Secretary Deb Haaland in her post in the Biden administration, first Native American to hold that position. So I think you're going to hear a lot more about that tribal perspective being included in Colorado River Basin discussions.
Steve or Heather, do you have the last word for us?
That's all you, Steve.
No, Evan, thanks. And thanks, Luke and Heather. In an hour, as we knew it would go by extremely quick, and it's so complex. I'm just excited to be part of hopefully coming up with solutions. And I think water equitability is a great thing. And I think we're all in this together. And I wouldn't feel comfortable ever as a professional or as a human being having some people have access to clean and safe, reliable drinking water and other people not due to money. So that's just me.
Well, Luke, Heather, Steve, I can't thank you enough. To our viewers, thank you for joining the inaugural Hurst Community Initiative Town Hall Speaker Series. This presentation was the last of 8 webinar events broadcasting every 2 weeks from April through July. Next spring, we hope to transition the Town Hall Speaker Series from virtual webinars to in-person convenings in collaboration with the regional public libraries and chambers of commerce of the Roaring Fork and Colorado River Valleys. Thanks again to Elizabeth Velasco and her team of interpreters at Velasco Language Services for your commitment to translating important information to our esteemed Spanish-speaking community throughout the region. Very special thanks to Alex Garcia Bernal and Garfield County Libraries for generously co-hosting, as well as the public libraries and chambers of commerce for co-sponsoring our inaugural Town Hall Speaker Series. And of course, to all of our esteemed moderators and panelists for sharing their unique expertise and informed perspectives throughout the series. You, our participating viewers, are always invited to check out new events, updates, and ongoing projects of the Aspen Institute's Hurst Community Initiative at aspen2parachute.org. And that's Aspen with the number 2 parachute.org. I'm Evan Zislis, Director of Community Engagement for the Aspen Institute's Hurst Community Initiative. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to connecting with you all very soon.
Thank you again, B and Dea. Have a great night.